Matthew chapter 3, beginning at verse 13. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Dave Edgars wrote a book entitled "What is the What?" It is the story of Valentino Deng, one of the Lost Boys of the Sudan. The name the Lost Boys was attached to thousands of young refugees from the civil war in southern Sudan. It broke out in the mid-1980s and continued for years up until 2005, when a ceasefire agreement was struck. Dave Edgars tells Valentino's story as though it is an autobiography. He writes it in the first person. Valentino's journey began when he was about 6 years old, and Muslim militiamen on horseback overran the community where he lived. Deng witnessed his hometown burn to the ground. Many of his friends and neighbors were killed or abducted, and he became separated from his parents. Not knowing whether his parents were dead or alive, Deng fell in with a group of similarly displaced boys, and an adult leader set them walking towards Ethiopia, where they were told they would find a haven. Many of the boys had no idea what an Ethiopia was. It was a long walk full of horrors. In the novel, there are scenes of famished boys ripping the flesh off a dead elephant they came across. A scene of a boy dragging a stick in the dirt, making a line in the sand so he would know his way home. Encounters with lions and hyenas, starving boys who gave up and simply lay down on the road along the way. Once across the border, a refugee camp became a recruiting ground for rebel leaders. They told the boys that they would become child soldiers and that they were the seed of a new Sudan. Driven out eventually by the Ethiopians, the boys escaped across the Gilo River in a hail of gunfire, except for those who got shot or intercepted by crocodiles. Reaching safety in Kenya, they found themselves trapped in a bleak refugee camp called Kakuma for, in Deng's case, 10 years. Eventually, many of the lost boys who survived ended up in the United States. Valentino Deng was one of the lucky ones, if you can call him that. He finally arrived and found a home in Atlanta, Georgia. And in Atlanta, the founder of a nonprofit that had been formed to help the lost boys of the Sudan connected with Valentino and introduced him to the author, Dave Edgars, with the hope that Edgars would help Valentino tell his story in a book. It turns out that Dave Edgars himself was something of a lost boy. His first book was a memoir telling his own story of how, when he was in college, both of his parents died of cancer within 5 weeks of each other, leaving Dave and his sister to raise their 7-year-old brother. And so together, these lost boys, Dave Edgars and Valentino Deng, produced this book entitled "What is the What?" It is a peculiar title, "What is the What?" The title comes from a creation story that Valentino remembers hearing as a child in the Sudan. Valentino was a member of the Dinka tribe. God, according to the story, made the first Dinka man tall and strong, and the first Dinka woman beautiful. And when he was done, he offered his creations a gift. He said, you can either have these cattle or you can have the what. What is the what? They asked, but God refused to answer. You see, the choice was a test. The Dinka could go for the cattle, which they knew would allow them to live well, or they could take a chance on the unknown. They knew that with the cattle, they could live with great contentment. If they treated the cattle well, they would have milk, and the cattle would multiply in number. They knew that they would be fools to pass up the cattle for the idea of the what. And so in the end, the man and the woman chose the cattle. And the Dinka people say that God proved that this was the right decision, that God was testing the first man and woman to see if they could appreciate what he had given them, to see if they could take pleasure in the bounty before them rather than trade it for the unknown. Unfortunately, as Valentino Deng and the Lost Boys came to know, as we know, our world is not full of peace and contentment for what we have in front of us. It is full of strife and dissatisfaction with what we have, and striving for something else, and war over someone else's land or oil or gold. The story of human history is a story of human beings consistently choosing the what over contentment with the gifts that we are given. And our inability to understand or internalize what we have been given and who we are keeps us from knowing contentment. Jesus came up from Nazareth and was baptized by John in the Jordan River. And as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens open up and the Holy Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Now there's a lot we could talk about with this story. Many questions we might have. Why does Jesus have to be baptized in the first place? What is the meaning of his baptism? But for today, I want to stop here with that voice, because this is the voice that we all long to hear, and these are the words that we need to hear. You are my son. You are my daughter. You are beloved, and with you I am well pleased. Not only are these the words of Jesus' baptism, but they are the words of our own. So important are they that we speak them and claim them when we baptize children. Remember your baptism and give thanks, we say. But often and over time, we forget the words, and it's hard to hear God's voice amidst so many competing voices that long for our attention. We're afraid of feeling forgotten or going unnoticed. We will do almost anything to distinguish ourselves as special, all the praise that we seek, all the recognition, the trophy, the degree, the office, the job, the promotion, the address, the accomplishments of our children, all the ways we endeavor to stand out, all the ways we use to assure ourselves that we matter, that we have a place in the world, that we are indeed beloved. All because we assume that we have to do something in order to receive God's attention, in order to receive God's blessing. Martin Copenhaver writes about this. He relates it to the first time he walked as a toddler. I don't remember the first time I walked, but I imagine it went something like this. I stood at the end of the room with my mother and my father, a full 3 steps away. Before that day, I could probably do a kind of dangling that almost looks like walking, when somebody held me by my hands and shifted me from side to side as my feet barely touched the floor. But this is the day when I will try a walk on my own, all holds barred, with just 2 eager parents, seemingly miles apart, there to cheer me on. So I set out, wobbling at first, and perhaps stumbling a little, but unmistakably making it on my own way from one set of arms to the other. And then I imagined that my parents lifted me high in the air with a shout of triumph as if no one in human history had ever walked before. Then, after numerous exclamations, I probably felt like the most loved, the most wonderful boy in the world. But after a time, I could walk with more assurance, but for some reason, I didn't receive so much praise. In fact, I can't remember the last time that anyone praised me for walking across a room, so I had to do other things. Simply walking just wasn't good enough anymore. I had to find ways to make a splash in other ways, just to get back to that feeling of being noticed, of being picked up with the light, of being valued. In all that striving, Martin Copenhaver writes, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that my parents did not praise me because of my accomplishments. Rather, they praised my accomplishments because they loved me, and would have loved me if there were no accomplishments to praise. If parents sometimes have something like unconditional love, a love without reasons for their children, how much more so does God love his children? And I know often in the church we've managed to mess this up. We've got it backwards. God loves you. God values you, not because you've distinguished yourself in some way, but because that is who you are. That is your identity. You are God's beloved. Henry Nouwen was a Catholic priest, writer, and professor. He left his position at Harvard University to become a chaplain at a community for mentally and physically challenged adults, Daybreak, north of Toronto. In one of his books, Nouwen tells the story of one of the members of that community, a wonderful woman named Janet, who one day approached him and asked him for a blessing. In response, Henry remembers giving her the sign of the cross on her forehead. But she said, "Henry, it doesn't work. That's not what I mean." He was a little embarrassed and said, "But Janet, I gave you a blessing." And she said, "No, I want to be blessed." He kept thinking, what does she mean? Later on, there was a worship service, and all the people in the community were there. After the service, Henry said, "Janet has asked me for a blessing." He had an alb on, a long robe with long sleeves, and Janet walked up to Henry and said, "I want to be blessed." She put her head against his chest, and he spontaneously put his arms around her and looked right into her eyes and said, "Blessed are you, Janet. You know how much we love you. You know how important you are. You know what a good person you are." She looked at Henry and said, "Yes, yes, I know. Henry says that he suddenly saw all sorts of energy coming back to her. She seemed to be relieved because she realized again that she was blessed. She went back to her place, and immediately other people said, "I want that kind of blessing too, Henry." Nouwen says, "Then countless people kept walking up to me, and I suddenly found myself embracing people." He said, "I remember that after that, a man in our community who assists the handicapped, a strong guy, a football player, said, "Henry, can I have a blessing too?" And now one remembers standing there in front of the community and putting his hand on the man's shoulder and saying, "John, it is so good that you are here. You are God's beloved son. Your presence is a joy for all of us. Always remember that you are loved with an everlasting love." And as Henry spoke these words, John looked at him with tears in his eyes, and then he said, "Thank you, Henry, thank you very much." Henry Nouwen writes of this experience, "We are all hungry for a blessing. We are all blessed. God is always speaking a word of blessing to our hearts. And when we know ourselves as blessed, we can't help but speak good things to other people and about other people and call forth their beauty and truth. As the blessed ones, we can walk through this world and offer blessings. It doesn't require much effort. It flows naturally from our hearts. I hope that wherever you are today, you will know yourself as a beloved son or daughter of God. What a difference it might make in our lives and in the life of the world if we knew this. I can think of nothing more powerful than God's blessing.